If you close your eyes and summon the image of the First World War in the Middle East, you likely see a scene straight out of a Hollywood epic. You see a vast blinding expanse of golden sand shimmering under a relentless sun. You see a man dressed in the flowing white robes of a Bedouin prince, but with the pale face and piercing blue eyes of an Englishman. He is riding a camel, leading a charging army of wild tribal warriors. They are screaming for freedom, their swords flashing as they descend upon a Turkish railway train. He is Lawrence of Arabia, the hero, the liberator, the scholar warrior who promised a proud people their independence and fought alongside them in the dust and blood to achieve it. It is one of the most enduring and romantic myths of the 20th century. It tells a story of honor and brotherhood where the British Empire, in a moment of benevolence, reached out a hand to help the Arab nation throw off the yoke of Ottoman oppression. It is a story of shared sacrifice where the modern West and the ancient East united against a common tyranny. But there's a fatal flaw in this story. It is a lie, a magnificent cinematic heartbreaking lie. At the exact same moment that Thomas Edward Lawrence was sitting by a campfire in the freezing desert night, promising an Arab prince that Britain would support a great and unified Arab kingdom from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, two other men were sitting in a quiet, luxuriously appointed room in London. They were not wearing dusty robes. They were wearing starched collars and expensive wool suits. They were not eating dried dates and drinking bitter coffee. They were sipping brandy and smoking fine cigars. One was a British aristocrat named Sir Mark Sykes. The other was a French diplomat named François Georges-Picot. On the table between them lay a map of the Middle East. It was a map of a region that had been ruled by the Ottoman sultans for 400 years. In their hands, they held a grease pencil and a wooden ruler. And with a few casual strokes and a conversation that amounted to little more than imperial horse trading, they drew a line. It was a straight, arbitrary line that slashed across the desert, ignoring tribal boundaries, ignoring river valleys, and ignoring mountains. It was a line that said, effectively, everything north of here belongs to France, and everything south of here belongs to Britain. They were stealing the land before the war was even won. They were carving up the carcass of the Ottoman Empire while the patient was still breathing, and they were doing it in absolute total secrecy. Lawrence didn't know. The Arab princes fighting and dying in the dunes didn't know. The world didn't know. This is the true story of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It is the story of the most consequential betrayal in the history of the modern Middle East. It is a story of how a secret deal made over lunch destroyed the dream of an Arab nation and created the fractured, violent, and unstable region we know today. It is the story of how the modern borders of Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine were born not from the will of the people who lived there, but from the greed and geopolitical paranoia of two fading empires. To understand the depth of this betrayal, we must first step back into the world of 1914. The Ottoman Empire, known as the sick man of Europe, was crumbling. It controlled the vast territories of the Arab world, but its grip was slipping. When the First World War erupted, the Ottoman government made the fatal decision to side with Germany and the Central Powers against Britain, France, and Russia. For the British Empire, this was a catastrophic development. The war was not just being fought in the mud of Flanders. It was a global conflict. And the Ottoman Empire sat directly on top of the British imperial lifeline. The Suez Canal, which ran through Egypt, was the artery that connected Britain to India, the jewel in the imperial crown. Millions of tons of goods and thousands of troops passed through that canal. If the Turks could march across the Sinai Peninsula and cut the canal, the British Empire would be severed in half. Britain would starve and India would be isolated. The British War Cabinet in London was terrified. They needed a strategy to distract the Ottomans. They needed to open a new front that would force the Turks to pull their troops away from the canal. They needed to destroy the Ottoman Empire from the inside. They looked at the map and they saw a potential ally in the heart of the Islamic world, the holy city of Mecca. Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam, were under Ottoman control, but they were locally ruled by a man named Hussein bin Ali. Hussein held the title of Sharif of Mecca. He was a Hashemite, a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. He was an old man, stubborn, proud, and deeply ambitious. For years, he had chafed under the heavy hand of the Turkish administration. He watched as the young Turk government in Istanbul tried to secularize the empire and impose the Turkish language on his people. Hussein dreamed of a different future. He dreamed of reestablishing a great Arab caliphate, a unified kingdom that would stretch from the burning sands of Yemen to the green mountains of Syria, all united under the rule of his family. The British intelligence services operating out of the Arab Bureau in Cairo saw an opportunity. They analyzed the situation with cold calculation. If they could convince Sharif Hussein to launch a religious revolt against the Ottoman Sultan, it would shatter the unity of Islam. The Ottoman Sultan had declared a jihad, or holy war, against the British. If the Sharif of Mecca, the descendant of the Prophet, declared a counter-jihad against the Turks, it would neutralize the spiritual threat. So the British High Commissioner in Egypt, a stern colonial administrator named Sir Henry McMahon, began a secret correspondence with Sharif Hussein. These letters, known as the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, are the smoking gun of this tragedy. In a series of letters exchanged between 1915 and 1916, McMahon made a promise that was explicitly designed to drag the Arabs into the war. On October 24, 1915, McMahon wrote a letter that would be quoted by Arab nationalists for the next century. He stated clearly that Great Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of the Arabs in all the regions within the limits demanded by the Sharif of Mecca. There were some caveats. McMahon excluded the coastal portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs Hama, and Aleppo, claiming they were not purely Arab. But to Hussein and his sons, the message was overwhelmingly clear. The vast majority of the Arab Middle East, including Palestine, Iraq, and the interior of Syria, would be theirs. McMahon was selling a dream. He was telling the Arabs, "You fight for us, and we will give you your kingdom. You bleed for us, and we will give you your freedom." Hussein believed the promise. He gathered his sons, Faisal Abdullah Ali and Zayd. They were the princes of the desert. They rallied the Bedouin tribes. On June 10, 1916, Sharif Hussein stood on the balcony of his palace in Mecca. He held a rifle in his hands. He aimed it at the Ottoman barracks and fired a single shot into the dawn sky. It was the signal. The Arab revolt had begun. Across the Hejaz, the region of western Arabia, the revolt spread like wildfire. Bedouin tribesmen who had been hiding in the hills descended upon Turkish garrisons. They cut telegraph lines. They attacked outposts. They marched north towards the great prize of Damascus, believing with every step that they were marching towards independence. Their liaison with the British military was a young and eccentric intelligence officer named Thomas Edward Lawrence. Lawrence was an anomaly in the British Army. He was not a career soldier. He was an archaeologist. Before the war, he had spent years walking through Syria and Palestine studying Crusader castles. He spoke Arabic fluently. He understood the complex web of tribal politics. He had a deep romantic love for the desert and its people. Lawrence was sent to the Hejaz to evaluate the revolt. He met Prince Faisal Hussein's third son and immediately saw in him the leader the revolt needed. Faisal was charismatic, brooding, and intelligent. Lawrence wrote that he saw Faisal as the man who would lead the Arabs to glory. Lawrence embedded himself with Faisal's army. He stopped wearing his British uniform. He put on the white robes of a sharif. He rode camels. He ate with his hands. He lived the life of a Bedouin warrior. He became the architect of their guerrilla war. He taught them how to use dynamite to destroy the Hejaz Railway, the iron spine that allowed the Turks to resupply their garrisons in Medina. Lawrence truly believed in the promise. He told the Arab leaders around the campfire that they were fighting for themselves. He assured them that the British government's word was its bond. He was the guarantor of the alliance. But T. Lawrence was a pawn in a game he did not yet understand. While Lawrence was in the desert, living on locusts and honey and dodging Turkish bullets, the real decisions were being made in the hushed corridors of the Foreign Office in London and the Quai d'Orsay in Paris. The British and French governments were not interested in Arab independence. They were empires. And empires, by their very nature, do not liberate, they conquer, they absorb, they exploit. The war in the Middle East was not a crusade for freedom. It was a land grab, a massive corporate merger of territory and resources. The British government was terrified that if the Ottoman Empire collapsed, another power might step into the vacuum. Perhaps Russia would push south. Perhaps the French would take too much. Britain wanted to secure the land bridge to India. They wanted the ports, and increasingly they wanted the oil. So in late 1915, the Allies appointed 2 negotiators to settle the future of the Middle East, once and for all. They were tasked with solving the Eastern question. Representing Britain was Sir Mark Sykes. Sykes was a fascinating and contradictory character. He was a wealthy baronet, a prolific traveler, and a conservative member of Parliament. He was brilliant, energetic, and famously arrogant. He claimed to be an expert on the East, but his knowledge was often superficial, based on the prejudices of the Victorian era. He viewed the Arabs through a lens of paternalism. He believed they were children, chaotic and primitive, who needed the steady guiding hand of the British Empire to enter the modern world. He believed that the British Empire had a God-given right to rule the world for the betterment of mankind. Representing France was François Georges-Picot. Picot was a different creature entirely. He was a hardened diplomat, a lawyer, and a fierce defender of the French colonial lobby. He was a man of stiff collars and stiffer principles. He was obsessed with Syria. For centuries, France had claimed a special role as the protector of the Christian communities in the Levant. Picot believed that Syria was French property by right. He was determined to ensure that the perfidious British didn't use the war as an excuse to push France out of the Middle East. The two men met in a series of secret meetings in London and Paris during the dark winter of 1915 and 1916. These were not formal diplomatic summits with press conferences. These were quiet, intimate meetings, often held over lunch or dinner. It was a negotiation of pure, cynical horse trading. They were dividing up millions of people, thousands of square miles, and centuries of history as if they were dividing a cake at a wedding. Imagine the scene. A large table covered in maps, maps that showed the Ottoman provinces, maps that showed the rail lines and the rivers. Sykes pointed to the map with his finger. He traced a line from the Mediterranean Sea across the desert to the Persian Gulf. He argued that Britain needed this land bridge. He wanted the ports of Haifa and Acre to serve as naval bases for the British fleet. He wanted a railway line that would run from Baghdad to Haifa, transporting troops and goods, and he wanted the oil. The geologists were already whispering about the black gold hidden beneath the sands of Mosul and Baghdad. Sykes wanted that oil for the Royal Navy. Picot pointed to the map and pushed back. He demanded the coast of Syria and Lebanon. He wanted the great cities of the interior, Damascus, Homs Hama, and Aleppo. He wanted a zone of influence that stretched deep into modern-day Turkey, into Anatolia. He argued that France had spilled millions of gallons of blood on the Western Front, and they deserved a prize equal to their sacrifice. They argued over details. They argued over water rights. They argued over the administration of specific towns. But they never once argued about the principle. Neither of them ever paused to question the moral right of two European men to decide the fate of millions of Arabs who were at that very moment fighting and dying for the Allied cause. Finally, they reached a compromise. They took a map of the Ottoman Empire and they drew the infamous line. It started at the E in Acre on the Mediterranean coast and ran almost straight east across the desert to the K in Kirkuk, near the Persian border. Everything north of the line was colored blue. This was the French zone. The coastal area would be directly ruled by France as a colony. The inland area, including the great Arab capitals of Damascus and Aleppo, would be a French zone of influence, where Arab chiefs might rule but only under French supervision. Everything south of the line was colored red. This was the British zone. The provinces of Baghdad and Basra would be directly ruled by Britain as a colony. The area between the Jordan River and the desert, including what is now Jordan and western Iraq, would be a British zone of influence. And what about Palestine? The Holy Land. This was a thorny problem. Both countries wanted it. Russia wanted it too because of the Orthodox churches in Jerusalem. The Vatican was concerned about the Catholic holy sites. So they compromised again. They colored Palestine brown on the map and labeled it an international administration. It was a vague solution to a problem they didn't want to solve yet. The deal was finalized in a letter signed on May 16, 1916. It was officially called the Asia Minor Agreement, but history remembers it by the names of its architects. The Sykes-Picot Agreement. It was a document of pure imperialism. It was a blueprint for theft. It completely and utterly contradicted the promises made to Sharif Hussein in the McMahon letters. Hussein had been promised a single unified Arab kingdom including Syria and Iraq. Sykes and Picot had just chopped that kingdom into pieces and shared it among themselves like spoils of war. Crucially, the agreement was classified as top secret. Only a handful of men in the inner circles of London, Paris, and Petrograd knew it existed. Sharif Hussein was not told. The Arab fighters, freezing in the desert nights, were not told. And T.E. Lawrence was not told. So the war went on. The lie remained buried in a safe in London while the blood continued to flow in the desert. The Arab revolt gained momentum. Under the command of Prince Faisal and advised by Lawrence, the Arab army pulled off a miracle. In July 1917, they captured the port of Aqaba. It was a daring raid. The Turkish guns at Aqaba were pointing out to sea, expecting a naval attack. Lawrence and the Arabs attacked from the land coming out of the impassable Nafud desert. They took the city from behind. It was a stunning victory. It proved that the Arabs were a capable fighting force. Lawrence rode across the Sinai Peninsula to Cairo to deliver the news to the new British commander, General Edmund Allenby. Allenby was a massive bull of a man. He was impressed by Lawrence. He supplied the Arabs with gold rifles and armored cars. He integrated the Arab army into his plans for the invasion of Palestine. The Arabs became the right flank of the British advance. They moved north, destroying the Hejaz railway bridge by bridge. They tied down tens of thousands of Turkish troops that would otherwise have been fighting the British. But as the armies moved north, Lawrence began to hear whispers. He began to sense that something was rotting at the heart of the alliance. He saw the way the British officers looked at the Arabs with a mixture of amusement and contempt. He saw the arrival of French advisors who treated the land as their own property. Lawrence began to suspect the existence of a treaty. He confronted his superiors, but they evaded his questions. In his memoirs, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence wrote with agonizing honesty about the crushing guilt he felt during this time. He wrote, "I was effectively an agent to foreign powers, exploiting the Arabs' national hope, calling them to fight for a freedom that was not to be theirs." He described himself as living a lie every day, pretending to be a friend while serving as the instrument of their betrayal. But he kept fighting. He formulated a desperate plan. He hoped that if the Arabs could capture Damascus, the ultimate prize, before the British army got there, they would present the world with a fait accompli. He hoped that if the Arabs were physically sitting in the government palace running the city, the politicians in London and Paris would be forced to accept reality. He hoped that the facts on the ground would override the secret treaties in the safe. The race for Damascus began. It was the autumn of 1918. The Ottoman army was collapsing. General Allenby broke through the Turkish lines at the Battle of Megiddo in Palestine. The Turkish retreat turned into a rout. The Arab army under Faisal raced up the desert flank, riding hard for the Syrian capital. On October 1st, 1918, the Arab forces entered Damascus. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. The dream seemed to be coming true. They raised the flag of the Arab Revolt, black, green, white, and red, over the government building. The people of Damascus flooded the streets. Women threw flowers from the balconies. Men fired rifles into the air. They were cheering the end of 400 years of Ottoman rule. They declared an independent Arab government. They proclaimed Faisal as their king. Lawrence was there. He drove his battered Rolls-Royce Blue Mist through the streets of the liberated city. He saw the joy in the faces of the people. But he felt no joy. He knew the clock was ticking. He knew the French were coming. Days later, General Allenby arrived in Damascus. He summoned Faisal and Lawrence to a meeting at the Victoria Hotel. The atmosphere in the room was icy. Allenby was a soldier following orders, and his orders were based on the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Allenby informed Faisal that his government would not be recognized as fully independent. He told him that under the agreement, which could now be revealed, Syria belonged to the French sphere of influence. He told him that a French representative would be arriving shortly to take supreme command. Faisal was shocked. He stood tall in his robes, his face pale with anger. He protested. He said he had been promised independence. He said his men had died for the city. He said, "I am a sovereign ruler. I will not accept French command." Allenby was unyielding. He looked at Lawrence and said, "But did you not tell him?" Lawrence looked at the floor. It was the moment of ultimate shame. Allenby told Faisal that he could administer the city for now, but only under the supreme command of the Allies. Lawrence could not bear it. Broken, exhausted, and ashamed, Lawrence asked Allenby for permission to leave. He resigned his post. He left Damascus before the French arrived. He returned to England, a famous hero, the uncrowned King of Arabia. But inside, he was a broken man haunted by the betrayal he had facilitated. But the story doesn't end with Lawrence leaving. The secret was out, but the Arabs still hoped to fight it diplomatically. The war ended in November 1918. The peace conference was set to be held in Paris in 1919. Faisal decided to go to Paris. He would plead his case to the world. He pinned his hopes on the Americans. President Woodrow Wilson had arrived in Europe like a messiah. He had issued his famous 14 points. He spoke of self-determination. He said that people should have the right to choose their own government. He said that the day of secret treaties was over. Faisal believed that Wilson and the United States would save the Arabs from the greed of the British and French. Faisal arrived in Paris in January 1919. He walked through the snowy streets of the French capital wearing his white and gold robes, a striking figure amidst the gray suits of the diplomats. T.E. Lawrence came out of retirement to serve as his translator and advisor. But they were walking into a lion's den. The Paris Peace Conference was not a meeting of minds. It was a market of victors. Faisal was treated like a curiosity, not a statesman. The British and French locked him out of the real meetings. When he was allowed to speak, the French delegation glared at him with open hostility. Georges Clemenceau, the French prime minister, was known as the Tiger. He was 77 years old, a hard-bitten cynic who cared nothing for Arab dreams. He was adamant. He wanted Syria. He told Lloyd George, the British prime minister, that France had suffered millions of dead in the trenches of the Western Front. France needed resources. France needed colonies. Syria was their prize, and they would not give it up for the sake of a Bedouin prince. Lloyd George was in a difficult position. He felt some sympathy for Faisal, or at least he felt the embarrassment of the broken promise. But he was a pragmatist, and he had his eyes on a new prize. During the war, new geological surveys had confirmed that the Vilayet of Mosul, the region allocated to France in the original Sykes-Picot Agreement, was sitting on a massive ocean of oil. Britain wanted that oil. So Lloyd George decided to cut a deal. In a private meeting, he told Clemenceau that Britain would abandon Faisal. Britain would withdraw its troops from Syria and hand the country over to France. Britain would betray the Arab army that had fought alongside them. In exchange, France would give up its claim to Mosul and allow Britain to attach it to their new mandate in Iraq. They traded Arab cities like poker chips. They traded the freedom of Damascus for the oil of Mosul. The deal was done. The Paris Peace Conference formalized the mandates. France was given the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Britain was given the mandate for Iraq and Palestine and Jordan. The Sykes-Picot map, with a few oil adjustments, became international law. Faisal returned to Damascus empty-handed, but the people of Syria refused to accept it. They were furious. They had tasted freedom, and they would not go back to being a colony. The Syrian National Congress declared full independence. They crowned Faisal as the king of the Arab Kingdom of Syria on March 8, 1920. It was the first modern independent Arab state. They drafted a constitution. They began to build a nation. France responded with brute force. They sent an army under General Henri Gouraud to crush the new kingdom. Gouraud was a one-armed veteran of Gallipoli, a hardliner who hated Arab nationalism. He issued an ultimatum to Faisal: surrender or be destroyed. The Arab army was small, poorly equipped, and made up of volunteers. They had no tanks, no airplanes, and very little ammunition. But they refused to surrender. They marched out to meet the French army at a mountain pass called Massillon on the road to Damascus. The Battle of Massillon was a massacre. It was a heroic suicide. The French tanks and artillery wiped out the Arab forces in hours. The Syrian Minister of War, Yusuf al-Azma, a gallant man who knew he would not win but refused to let the French enter without a fight, was killed leading a charge. On July 24, 1920, the French army marched into Damascus. The dream was dead. The independent Arab state had lasted only 5 months. There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, but deeply symbolic about General Gouraud. When he entered Damascus, he rode his white horse straight to the tomb of Saladin, the great Muslim leader who had defeated the Crusaders centuries earlier. Gouraud walked into the tomb, kicked the sarcophagus, and said, "Awake, Saladin, we have returned." The Crusades were over. The colonial partition of the Middle East had begun. This brings us to the end of the first chapter of this tragedy. We have seen the promise, the betrayal, and the conquest. But the story of the British and French in the Middle East gets even darker. The lines they drew were just the beginning. The French general Henri Gouraud stood in the ancient city of Damascus in the summer heat of July 1920. The dust from the Battle of Massillon had settled, but the smoke of burning villages still hung in the air. The Arab army was destroyed. King Faisal, the man Lawrence had promised a kingdom, was packing his bags fleeing into exile on a train to Palestine. The French tricolor flag was flying over the Umayyad Mosque. Gouraud looked at the map that Sykes and Picot had drawn 4 years earlier. It was no longer just a drawing in a diplomat's notebook. It was now a reality enforced by French bayonets, tanks, and airplanes. But conquering the land was one thing. Ruling it was another. The British and French had invented new countries, but they hadn't invented nations. A nation is a group of people who feel they belong together, who share a history and a destiny. The lines drawn in 1916 had trapped people together who had no desire to be united, and separated people who had been one family for centuries. France in particular adopted a policy of divide and rule. It was a strategy as old as the Roman Empire. They looked at Syria and they saw a threat. Arab nationalism was strong in the Sunni cities of Damascus and Aleppo. The French feared that if Syria remained united, it would constantly rebel against them. So they decided to slice it up even further. They decided to atomize the country. They took a scalpel to the Syrian map. They carved out a state for the Alawites, a minority sect along the coast, giving them their own capital in Latakia. They created a state for the Druze in the southern mountains, playing on their fierce independence. They separated Aleppo from Damascus, creating regional rivalries. And most fatefully, they created Greater Lebanon. Lebanon had traditionally been a small mountain refuge for the Maronite Christians, a jagged range of peaks called Mount Lebanon. But the French wanted to turn their Christian allies into a regional power. They wanted to give them a viable state. So they took a pen and expanded the borders of Mount Lebanon. They added the coastal cities of Tripoli and Sidon and Tyre. They added the fertile Bekaa Valley. But there was a problem. These new areas were full of Sunni and Shia Muslims. By expanding the Christian state, the French had diluted the Christian majority. Suddenly, the Christians were barely 50% of the population. To manage this, the French created a rigid confessional political system. Power was shared based on religion. The president had to be a Christian, the prime minister a Sunni, the speaker a Shia. It looked like a clever balance. In reality, it was a time bomb. It institutionalized sectarianism. It taught people to think of themselves not as Lebanese citizens, but as members of a sect fighting for a slice of the pie. 50 years later, that bomb would explode into a 15-year civil war that would turn Beirut from the Paris of the East into a wasteland of rubble. Meanwhile, the British were struggling with their own invention, Iraq. If Syria was sliced apart, Iraq was glued together. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a country. The British had stitched together 3 Ottoman provinces that had very little in common. Mosul in the north was Kurdish mountainous and looked towards Turkey. Baghdad in the center was Sunni Persian influenced and cosmopolitan. Basra in the south was Shia Marshy and looked towards the Persian Gulf and India. The only thing these 3 groups agreed on was that they didn't want the British there. In 1920, just as the French were crushing Syria, Iraq erupted. It was a massive spontaneous revolt. The Shia clerics in Karbala issued fatwas against the British. The Kurdish tribes in the north picked up their rifles. It was a full-scale national war of independence. The British were caught off guard. They had 100,000 troops in the country, but they were losing control. The cost of the occupation was skyrocketing. The British public, exhausted by World War I, demanded that troops come home. Winston Churchill, who was then the colonial secretary, needed a cheap solution. He found two. First, he decided to rule Iraq from the air. This was the birth of air policing. The Royal Air Force built massive bases in the desert. When a tribe rebelled or refused to pay taxes, the British didn't send soldiers, they sent biplanes. They bombed the villages. They dropped incendiary devices on the mud huts. It was brutal, effective, and cheap. Second, he needed a king. The British realized they couldn't rule Iraq directly as a colony. It was too provocative. They needed a local face. They needed a proxy. They remembered Faisal, the man the French had just kicked out of Syria. He was unemployed. He was a Hashemite. He was a war hero. And he was indebted to the British. So, in a conference in Cairo in 1921, Churchill decided to simply move Faisal from Syria to Iraq. It was like transferring a CEO from one failing branch of a company to another. Faisal had never been to Iraq. He was from Mecca. He didn't speak the local dialect. He was a Sunni king imported to rule a majority Shia country. The British staged a coronation. They rigged a referendum claiming 96% of Iraqis voted for Faisal. It was a farce. Faisal arrived in Baghdad to the sound of a British military band playing God Save the King. He was a decent man, a moderate man, but he was a king without a country. He was trapped in a gilded cage. If he worked too closely with the British, his people called him a traitor. If he opposed the British threatened to remove him. This was the pattern of the Mandate period. The British and French set up governments that were designed to be weak. They backed minority groups to rule over majorities. They favored tribal sheikhs over urban intellectuals. They stunted the growth of real democratic institutions because democracy might produce a government that wanted them to leave. And then there was the oil. This was the dirty secret that Sykes and Picot had only guessed at, but which became the dominant fact of the 20th century. In 1927, at a place called Baba Gurgur near Kirkuk, a massive oil well came in. It was a gusher. Suddenly, the sandy barren land of the British Mandate was one of the most valuable prizes on earth. The British made sure they locked it down. They forced the Iraqi government to sign the Red Line Agreement. It handed the rights to Iraq S-Oil to a consortium of Western companies, including British Petroleum Shell and the French. The Iraqi government got a tiny royalty of a few shillings per ton. The vast wealth of the nation was siphoned off to London and Paris and New York. This theft of resources fueled a deep, simmering anger. A new generation of Arabs was growing up. They were not tribal sheikhs. They were army officers, lawyers, teachers, and engineers. They looked at the maps drawn by Sykes and Picot, and they felt humiliated. They looked at their puppet kings and they felt disgusted. They looked at the oil pipelines carrying their wealth away and they felt robbed. They began to dream of a new kind of freedom, not the freedom promised by Lawrence of Arabia, which depended on British benevolence, but a freedom taken by force. This led to the age of the coup. In Iraq, the military became the center of nationalist sentiment. In 1936, 1941, and finally in 1958, the army rose up. The 1958 revolution was particularly brutal. The royal family, the dynasty established by the British, was massacred in the palace courtyard. The king was shot. The crown prince's body was dragged through the streets of Baghdad. It was a violent rejection of the British-imposed order. But what replaced it was not democracy. It was dictatorship. Strong men like Saddam Hussein rose to power, promising to restore Arab dignity and erase the artificial borders. Saddam Hussein was a child of Sykes-Picot. He was obsessed with the humiliation of the past. When he invaded Kuwait in 1990, he justified it by claiming that Kuwait was an artificial state created by the British to cut Iraq off from the sea. He was using the twisted logic of the colonial map to justify a new war. In Syria, the French Mandate ended in 1946, after a bloody struggle where the French actually shelled the Syrian parliament. But the sectarian divisions the French had fostered remained. The country was unstable, rocking from one coup to another. Finally, the Ba'ath Party seized power. They were secular nationalists who preached Arab unity. But in reality, the regime came to be dominated by the Alawites, the minority sect the French had empowered back in the 1920s. The Assad family built a brutal police state to hold the fractured country together, using fear to bridge the gaps the French had created. And then there is Palestine. The brown zone on the Sykes-Picot map, the international zone. Britain took control of it in 1920. They had made conflicting promises. To the Arabs, in the McMahon letters, they promised independence. To the Jews, in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, they promised a national home. The British spent 30 years trying to juggle these two promises and failed miserably. They allowed Jewish immigration, which caused Arab riots. Then they restricted immigration, which caused Jewish riots. They satisfied no one. By 1948, Britain simply gave up. They packed their bags and left, leaving the two sides to fight a war that is still going on today. The map of Palestine and Israel is the most contested, bloodiest map in the world, a direct legacy of British duplicity, and the vague brown smear on Mark Sykes' map. So where does this leave us today? Look at the headlines. The civil war in Syria, the fragmentation of Iraq, the paralysis in Lebanon, the conflict in Gaza. These are not separate, unconnected events. They are the aftershocks of the earthquake of 1916. The borders of the Middle East remain the borders drawn by Mark Sykes and François Georges-Picot, but they are borders that exist on paper, not in the hearts of the people. The Kurds, a people betrayed by every treaty, are still spread across 4 countries, dreaming of a Kurdistan that the mapmakers denied them. The Sunnis and Shias in Iraq are still struggling to find a way to share a country that was forced upon them. The Lebanese are still trapped in the sectarian cage built by the French. History is not just about the past, it is about the present. The story of Sykes-Picot is a warning. It is a warning about the arrogance of power. It is a warning that you cannot draw lines on a map and expect people to fit into them. It is a warning that betrayal has a long half-life. T.E. Lawrence died broken-hearted because he saw the future. He saw that the wind he had sown would become a whirlwind. In 1935, he was killed in a motorcycle accident on a quiet English country lane. A tragic figure who had tried to bridge 2 worlds and failed. Mark Sykes didn't live to see the chaos he created. He died of the Spanish flu in 1919, right in the middle of the peace conference in Paris. François Georges-Picot faded into obscurity, serving as a diplomat in various posts, never realizing that his name would become a curse word for millions of people. But their legacy is written on the map. Every time you see the news from the Middle East, every time you see the violence and the anger, you are looking at the ghosts of Sykes and Picot. You are looking at the consequences of the day 2 men in suits decided they knew better than the people who lived there. The Middle East is not broken because the people there are incapable of peace. It is broken because the modern state system was built on a foundation of lies. It was built on a betrayal. And until the people of the region are allowed to draw their own map to write their own future, the ghost of Sykes and Picot will continue to haunt the sands. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.